Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be giving one of the 2020 BGRI Technical Workshop keynotes. My name is Hale Tufan, and I'll be talking about closing the gap between genes and gender. First of all, why have this talk? It may be obvious for some of you, but I'd like to reiterate what's called the gender gap. Plots managed by women are 20 to 30% less productive than those managed by men for several reasons. Women have less access to land, fewer years of formal education, less access to finance and credit, and technologies such as fertilizers and seeds. All of this culminates to very different experiences that face men and women as farmers and the benefits that they reap from agricultural livelihoods. This is very similar in wheat-based production systems. Wheat-based production systems have been defined by social heterogeneity, high poverty levels, and restrictive gender norms. Improved varieties, though prioritized by both women and men as top innovations, when we look at just what women are looking for, access to external partners such as seed companies, extension agents, and NARs, and peer networks such as cooperatives and groups are specifically important. Looking at wheat research as a community and literature reviews show that cultural norms around men and women are perpetuated in research outputs. Men are really identified with technology and farming, where women are really framed in a more traditional and home-based role. When we look at wheat breeding specifically, there are trait-level studies that show product and seed quality is more important for women than for men, for example, in Nepal and Ethiopia. But that location matters, and these are not fixed, that men at times ranked product quality higher than women, depending on location. All of this to say, the bottom line is gender determines what a wheat farmer and many farmers have access to. Land, labor, inputs, information, credit, technology, and machinery. And women and girls really face systematic barriers to owning and managing farms. Yet they still plow the land and tend to fields planted with wheat varieties whose development they really have no power to influence. And this matters because if we look at gender and agricultural research for development, focusing on women and gender equality is important because it's not just effective, but it's also the right thing to do. So none of this may be new to you, but what can we do differently, especially in wheat breeding? I'd like to introduce this concept called design thinking. This really comes from the technology sector, and this particular idea is coming out of Stanford University, which says that designing a product should not start with the product, but the people and the problem that you're trying to solve. So the first steps are really understanding the challenges, articulating problems, and then continuously testing different solutions to those problems. But this hasn't just stayed within technology, and within the same Stanford University, there's an initiative called Gendered Innovations, where scholars are looking at different technology, but engineering and health innovations and interventions to see how these are different for men and women. An example is crash test dummies. Crash test dummies' bodies are designed to mimic those of men. But what happens is, especially a woman's pregnant body is not taken into consideration when these crash tests are done, which means that the leading cause of fetal death related to maternal trauma are still car accidents because those crash intervention and safety standards are really developed towards the male body. The same is true for heart disease. Heart disease symptoms and treatments are based on male bodies. So the fatality rate for women is higher from heart attacks because everything we know has been designed based on men's bodies. All of this has been recognized, especially by the European Union, where integrating gender in research, both in team building and also in research subjects, has become a non-negotiable factor in any funding. And this is through the research cycle, from the idea phase, proposal development, creating working environments that are favorable for women, deciding what kind of data to collect and how to disseminate the results. At this point, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with plant breeding? If we take that same idea of design thinking, we should really be thinking that plant breeding is more about people than plants. How do we start with people and not the plants that we're breeding for? And at this stage, you might be thinking, but varieties are gender neutral. They don't care where they're grown, or the benefits of varieties are for everyone in the household. There are no specific traits that are important for women, or we can't breed varieties only for women, which are all valid arguments in themselves. But plant breeding really is inherently market and user driven, because to be adopted, varieties must meet the needs and benefit farmers. But not all farmers are the same. So when we think about priority setting, who are we priority setting for? Most crop breeding programs define their breeding objectives through expert input. That means breeders talking to breeders or agronomists. And we often define our target environment to be more geographical than focused on demography, so more natural rather than the socioeconomic environment. And a wide variety of traits from a diversity of users and users really presents a challenge for breeding programs in terms of how to breed for all of those traits. Which means that maybe we end up with a prioritized reduced number of common denominator traits that are designed to impact the largest possible number of people, which makes sense, but it doesn't give us the positive impacts for women and girls that we need. So how can we have gender responsive priority setting? By firstly recognizing that traits may follow gender divisions of labor and market access broadly. But it's also a matter of power and decision making. Who controls the gene flow? Who determines which genetic qualities are valued in which markets for which purpose? And to understand really through careful diagnostic and gender analysis, the diversity of users, their needs, goals, and livelihood strategies means that we should not be just focusing on genetic gains, but also gender equality gains. And this is really seen more and more. The EIB, you may have seen some of the templates going out for EID for product profiles, but there's really a focus on a clear understanding of who and what you're breeding for to be able to develop product profiles and breeding targets. And these are facilitated through what's called product profile contracts and processes and cross-functional teams, which are interdisciplinary teams, which is a great opportunity to formalize breeding commitments and an entry point for gender integration and help bring in gender and social difference research to help set targets. And yearly reviews of these targets really open doors to new evidence and information from gender research for course correction. And as we define market segments for our breeding targets, we should be thinking about not only acreage and profitability, but impact on women and girls. There are initiatives specifically looking at this. As a particularly interesting one called Gender and Breeding Initiative that I'm a part of, where we're looking at how can you make a breeding program more gender responsive. And these are some central tenets. Knowing when, where, and why women are a particularly important beneficiary group and responding to that. Anticipating how design decisions are impacted by women and impact women in turn. And how designing breeding objectives specifically to benefit women farmers is really important to recognize and to target. And then being accountable for those decisions by tracking impact over time. And there have been various frameworks developed. This one is interesting, looking at the breeding cycle and how there are gender responsive decision points and gender responsive results stemming from those at key stages of breeding processes. And there's also tools being developed to look at product profiles and traits to classify them as having positive benefits or potentially harmful benefits on women and girls, and being able to quantify those to weight them in product profiles. At the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement, we're also taking a step back to see how we can integrate not only gender research, but nutrition, resilience, and market information to make sure that product profiles are being designed with impact in mind. Next, I'd like to talk about a case study on a project called NEXTGEN Cassava, which is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and DFID co-funded project in Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda on cassava improvement. For this project, we also wanted to take a look at how we can make our breeding more end-user oriented and gender responsive. We did this through a multi-pronged approach, looking at using qualitative methods to look at trait descriptors and how these were described and prioritized by farmers, but also looking at quantitative methods to really understand trait typologies, ranks, and weights, and then triangulating that with on-farm choices that men and women farmers were making, to really match what's called the explicit choices through the typologies with the tacit choices, so the decisions that were made on farm for which varieties to favor over the others. We used some different methodologies. We combined what's called 1000 Mind, which is a marketing analysis tool that's been used for crop improvement just recently. And also TriCot, which is an on-farm testing method that brings in many different farmers in a simplified on-farm testing. And also rural household surveys such as ROMIS in this case. And we use these together to really, again, triangulate different sources of information to get good breeding priorities that reflect end users and demand. So we look at value chain roles and look at the typologies across those value chain roles. This is specifically in Uganda and Nigeria. And then we look at the intersection of these typologies with poverty indicators, sex, ethnicity, age, and location, to see how those typologies change with those social differences. And we also look at the household and see how traits and choices are negotiated between conjugal couples. And we do this across multiple time point trait combinations using geographically representative sampling. So the first step that we did was really taking a look and curating knowledge of what's known around gendered use and differences around traits, specifically in Nigeria for cassava production. What we do know in Nigeria about cassava production is that women really dominate processing and marketing of processed products, but they also provide labor for processing and production. When we look at traits that were prioritized, overall, there were traits that were prioritized both by men and women, while there were some that were specifically important for women and men. But what's interesting is if we look at the household use of cassava across men and women in different regions, in some regions, there were significant differences around how cassava was used in the household and how those were reflected by men and women, where in some other regions that disappeared. So if we only looked at men versus women across Nigeria, we would make assumptions based on how cassava was used. So it was really important to have that regional disaggregation as well. When we look at the typologies and the farmers, we saw three different types of farmers emerging, those that were looking at survival as their primary driver for choice, and those that were looking at quality of the product as a driver of their choices. And as a third category, those looking at output, so the yield, fruit size, maturity, etc. What's interesting things across these three categories, women were overrepresented in the quality category, which is not surprising knowing that women really are active in processing and selling of processed cassava products. But also it mattered along the role along the value chain also had an implication on which group individuals were falling into. Age mattered, as did region and use of improved cassava varieties. Just to say that just looking at the sex of the individual is of course not enough, that there's all these intersecting factors that help explain the different typologies of cassava that farmers were prioritizing. And the last bit of work I'll talk about is looking at intra-household spousal differences and trait preferences. So we use the same 1000 Minds marketing tool to look at typologies of traits and trade-offs, but we interviewed wives, their husbands, and then the couple together and compared those three sets of responses. And what we saw is that individually significantly different ranking of profitability, maturity, and product quality between wives and husbands. And as a couple, the rankings for these, when they interviewed as a couple versus individually, that the rankings for these appear closer to husband responses for profitability and maturity, but closer to wives responses for product quality. What this means is that negotiation as a couple really evens out some of these more significant choices to come to a negotiated response. And during the couples interviews, the changes in responses were not that significantly different except for maturity and Gari swelling, which is a product quality trait. So husbands changed their score more than wives for maturity. So again, negotiating to a middle ground where the same was true for wives. So that just shows that it's not only not enough to look at men and women across different regions and the different social differences that intersect with that being a man or a woman, but also within a household, how these traits and varieties were being negotiated for prioritization. So in summary for this short talk, I hope that I've been able to show you that addressing the needs of women and girls in wheat improvement really requires holistic approaches. Just looking at traits or just looking at adoption is not enough. It really does require reviewing priorities, power, and process in current wheat breeding systems, and having an honest reflection of how those could be shifted to intentionally benefit women and girls. And the interdisciplinary teams are really non-negotiable to be able to breed for impact. So linking with social scientists, especially gender researchers, is critical. And I hope that you can all consider to embrace the complexity of social context and difference as much as you embrace the genetic complexity that you see in breeding. On that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.